Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Rural education doesn't stop at graduation. For many rural students, the real cliff shows up after high school, when transportation, affordability, and access to advising determine whether college ready turns into college completed. Today, I'm joined by Rachel Rush-Marlowe, an education policy leader whose work has focused deeply on rural post-secondary access and the role of rural community college as both education providers and community anchors. Rachel has researched and written about rural community college capacity, enrollment pressures, and the supports that students need to persist, especially older students and working parents. Today, we're going to talk about what rural community colleges are up against, what's working, what's missing, and how K-12 and higher education can stop operating in separate worlds. So let's get to it. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad we were able to make this happen.
So am I. After many starts and fits and stops, we finally got a chance to get together. So I'm glad that we're going to be able to have this conversation.
Likewise.
I would love to start with really what pulled you toward community colleges in rural places and rural student success. So what does that through line from when you started in education to where you are now look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think my, interest in working with rural students and rural education is really driven by my personal and lived experience. I never thought I was going to work in education. It wasn't something that I knew from a young age, despite the fact that both my parents were educators, I have a lot of family working in education. Initially did a lot of work overseas and thought I wanted to work in international law. And eventually made my way back to the U.S. to get my graduate degree in policy, and I was taking an education policy class, and all of a sudden it kind of clicked, and I was like, oh, this is it. Like, I want to work in education. I tried for a little while teaching, and my parents were thrilled, but I was like, but teaching's not it, but I do want to work in education. And I felt like I had really discovered my path. And then, when I graduated and started working in education, I was enjoying my work and doing a lot of work more with student data and kind of trying to understand trends in data. And then had an opportunity to start doing a project with rural community colleges. And I had never really, before that point, I suppose there were things I knew about myself that I had grown up in a rural community, right? But had never thought of that as a really important part of my identity, and certainly not a part of my identity that was an asset to my work. And all of a sudden was thrown into this project, working with rural community colleges. And there were just so many things, even though, of course, every rural community looks so different, there were things about my background and experience that just made me feel so much more connected than anything I had done before. And so was really excited to have, that opportunity to connect in education in that way. And I think, one of the earliest experiences working on this project, my boss and I had an opportunity to be, embedded in a rural community and talking to them about the challenges they were facing in that, exactly what you described, right? That like high school to college pipeline, and where we know a lot of students fall out. Rural students, I don't think any of your listeners will be surprised to know, graduate high school at higher rates than their urban and suburban peers, have higher GPAs than their urban and suburban peers, but college going is much lower, right? And so like trying to figure out that disconnect. And in one of the communities we spoke to, they said, nobody ever comes here for their college, career fair days. We don't have colleges recruiting from us. And I had this moment where I was like, do colleges do that? Because I had never experienced that. Like, I didn't know that college fairs were a thing that happened at high schools. I was very fortunate that, my parents, had advanced educations themselves, and that was always the path for me. But, that wasn't the case for my peers. And it never even occurred to me that was the case for other students. And so this work has felt really meaningful in that way. And I think on the community college side in particular, I think really community colleges are the best opportunity that we can give students especially those who don't think of themselves as college going or as college as an option, because unfortunately we really do have such an affordability crisis in this country, right? And I'd love to say that every type of institution is an option for every student. That should be the case. And unfortunately, even though there are scholarships and there's, conversations we could have about, sticker price and actual price and all these things, but college is cost prohibitive for a lot of families right now, and community college removes at least that barrier, right? We know that there are many others. And so it feels really meaningful for me to work in this space where, on one side of the family, my dad's family immigrated to the United States a few generations back because college was not an option for people like us. And on, my mom's side of the family, I think can really very easily pinpoint our family's kind of economic trajectory via my grandfather's access to the GI Bill. He grew up frequently unhoused and had a high school teacher who really took him in. And then, after his time in the service was able to go to college because of the GI Bill. And so I've really seen, in my own personal experience, both what it's like to be a rural student, what kind of opportunities rural students do and don't get. And also the opportunity that college can give to really change generations of lives. And I think community college is a great, economic engine for that.
Yeah. You've talked about how rural community colleges really are community infrastructure, that they serve as anchors. Can you talk more about what that means, Rachel, in terms of real life in a rural town?
Absolutely. So I grew up in places where, the college was the center of the town, and have worked in many a community that looks just like that. We know that from research that in many rural communities, the college is, in addition to being the things that we think about colleges traditionally as being, it's the chief driver of the economy. It's the number one job provider in town. It's the number one place for entertainment in town, right? Whether that be sports or art exhibitions. And so we really see, especially right now as we're facing enrollment cliffs, fewer and fewer young people enrolling in college, a lot of fears and conversations and reality around college consolidation, college closure. And I really worry about what that looks like for, the entire kind of vibrancy and thriving of many rural communities that are exactly like you said. I mean, they're the entire community infrastructure.
When that happens, when a community college does have to shutter, what does the community lose? And maybe they've not closed, but they've weakened or they've started to shrink programming. What does that do to the local area around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can talk about a whole number of downstream effects, right? Many of which are maybe easier or more challenging to study and quantify than others. But being in education, moving a little bit away from the general infrastructure and back to the education focus, it's a huge loss of opportunity for our students. Going back to kind of the beginning of our conversation and talking about this discrepancy between high graduation, high GPA, and then lowered enrollment, a big part of that has to do with proximity, right? There's very strong research that indicates the majority of college students in the U.S. Attend school, 60 or 30 miles or less from home. Right. The traditional, people perhaps outside of the field, when you hear traditional college student, you imagine, right, like an 18-year-old flying across the country, moving into their dorm with their new best friend, right? The reality is the majority of students in the United States attend community college, are over 25, at least a quarter of them have children they're supporting, and college close to home. Many community colleges have dorms, but most community college students live at home and commute. And so the farther that you have to go to attend school, the less likely you are to attend, period. And so when we talk about, program closure, school consolidation, entire institution closure, we're setting ourselves up for another generation of individuals that aren't going to get educated. That I think is the thing that concerns me the most. And then of course there's, broader implications for the entire economy of the community that those institutions are in.
Yeah. As you're talking, one of the things that I'm thinking in my head is it sounds like the same challenges that a school district, a K-12 system in a rural place might face as well. And those are consistent structural challenges like finance or staffing, broadband, enrollment swings. Those are things that, that non-rural leaders tend to underestimate as having some really major impacts. Rachel, what would you say is probably the most urgent challenge right now for community colleges?
Yeah, wow. To pick just one, I think this conversation around closure is a pressing one, right? And it is, similar in the K-12 areas. It's a challenge in rural communities in general, right? There's a lot of population loss. Some rural communities are growing, right? But not many. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity, knowing what we know about demographic changes and patterns, to identify some, great opportunities to turn things around. And I think bringing K-12 into the conversation is a piece of it, right? In terms of some of the challenges in K-12, I think there's great opportunities to mitigate some of the challenges in post-secondary and K-12 institutions by coming together. We've seen a lot of rural districts have issues and revert to 4-day weeks, right? Because of staffing shortages, funding shortages. And we've seen in a couple of communities some really innovative approaches where K-12 districts and community colleges are partnering together to kind of expand dual enrollment and other programming opportunities. So the community college is getting a little bit of an enrollment boost, right? They have more dual enrollment. We're also setting students up for success and that they understand what college looks and feels like ahead of time. They might be even earning credits towards an associate's or certificate. The K-12 district, right, is getting that benefit of they don't have a 5th day of programming, but we know kids still need that school time and parents still need, childcare, right, essentially, and also opportunities for kids to learn on that 5th day. So I think there's some really, really cool things that we can do and that rural places are especially suited for, right, and coming up with these unique solutions. Of course, it requires funding, right? Or figuring out kind of what the funding model will be, who's going to pay for those dual enrollment credits, where are the students physically going to be, at their K-12 institution, in which case you have to have the community college staff willing to travel or vice versa. So not to say that there's any kind of silver bullets here, but, I think because rural communities have so many assets, like relationships, right? It's often as simple as, I think in a lot of conversations, when people try to quantify or try to get down to like the nitty gritty of like, well, what is it that makes these things work, right? Like a lot of the research that we do, because a lot of our work is very research based, people want to find those answers, right? Of like, well, why did this solution work? And the why frequently is leading to the next step, right? Of how do we scale?
Yeah.
Which is, the word scale drives me nuts when we're in rural context, right? Because it doesn't need to scale. It can work in one place and maybe it will work in another place, but that doesn't make it a national solution. I don't think it needs to be, right? But what we frequently identify that no one ever likes to hear, right? At the end of a conversation of, you created this really innovative, dual enrollment approach, right? It's solving all these problems we just described. How did it work? What was the secret sauce? And it's like the secret sauce was Melissa and Rachel are neighbors. And they got to talking at dinner one night and they said, you know what? I think we can make this work, right? Like in every community that we've worked in where we find something so programming that's really effective, something that's working really well for kids, like it comes down to the people. It comes down to, at least 1 or 2 or 5 people knew each other. They knew the assets that they as individuals had and what that could look like when they brought them together as a community and they made it happen. And sometimes you can replicate that and sometimes you can't, right? Because it's really about relationships.
Yeah. Oh, that's so well said. That's very, very well said and so true. Absolutely true. Where I've never heard it put that way, that it doesn't have to scale. It could just be what's right for that.
Don't tell the funders that, right? Like philanthropy never wants to hear it can't scale, even when it's in a rural context, but it really doesn't have to.
Yeah. Yeah. I would switch gears just a little bit here and tell me what you wish that high schools understood about what students face, especially rural students, in that first semester of their schooling career at the higher ed level.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think there are so many things around preparation for, I'll say culture, but I mean culture a little bit more broadly in terms of not just how to behave on campus or what to expect on campus in terms of your peers and engagement with professors, but also just kind of like the rules of engagement in some ways. And I'll give a concrete example, and I shared already, right? Despite going to what I think was a pretty well-resourced and well-organized high school. We were in a pretty rural community, and there was very little advising, very little conversations about college success. And so in my first month, maybe, I think, on campus, I signed up for one of my, required gen eds in astronomy, and I failed the first exam. I mean, bombed it. It was like a 300-person lecture, which, first of all, my entire school had done 300 kids, right? So that was totally overwhelming. So I think that's one piece of the culture component, right? Just in thinking about, if you're in a room that big, find one person, right? Find a buddy, find someone you can take notes with, or you can get notes from if you're not in class. Go to office hours, right? You need the professor to know you. But more importantly than that, what I really was trying to get at is the kind of rules of engagement, the structure of behaving on campus and how things work. But I don't think we've set students up for success well enough. And so I bombed this first exam, and I'm crying, and I'm already kind of a stats nerd, and I know all the statistics about how many kids don't make it through their first year of college. And I'm like, that's it. This is me. I'm not going to make it. I'm done. And I call my dad crying, and I'm like, I failed this exam, and I've done all the math, and I don't know if it's even going to be possible for me to pass the, class if I don't get 100 on everything else. And what are the chances of that? And he's like, well, you're taking a course overload this semester, right? You 15, 16 credits. I'm like, I don't know, what's a credit and what is all this? And he's like, well, why don't you when's the add drop period? What's an add drop period? Of course, so he explains to me, well, you just need 12 credits to be full time. You can drop a class. If you really are worried about it, just, you take this class later. It's not required that you take it this very first semester. I had no idea, that an add drop period existed. And I just think all the time about that experience. My dad is a college professor, and has worked at a college my entire life. And so, with one phone call, I was able to kind of breach this hurdle, right? Get over this hurdle, drop my class, have that reduced course load, adjust to college in the way I needed. But I think about for so many of my peers who, didn't happen to have the family that I had. And I think that that's something, again, I go back and forth on this because I worry that we put a lot of pressure on our academic institutions, K-12 and postsecondary, right, to be everything for students.
Yep.
Especially in situations where, perhaps what's really missing is a social safety net, right? And we're really expecting our institutions to do and be everything. But I think in this particular context, helping students understand some of the basics of how to engage, how to be a college student. Hey, 12 credits is the minimum to be full-time. If you're taking more than that, here's some things to think about. An add drop period is. Here's what withdrawing. Here's where financial deadlines come into play, right? I think there's some basic things like that we're really doing a disservice to our students by not setting them up with that information.
Yeah. Good point. And you mentioned a lot of rural students are also workers or caregivers or adults, parents returning to school. Where do institutions unintentionally design systems that really push those students out?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think there are a lot of systems that, and maybe in the course of this, I'll come across a few examples. But one thing that really struck me recently is Trellis Strategies put out their annual financial wellness survey of students. And one of the questions that they ask in the survey, and they reach an incredible number of students. It's a huge end size in the survey. And one of the questions that they asked was, do you think of yourself as, I can't remember the exact categories, but I want to say, an employee who also goes to school or a student who also works, right? Setting up all these different identity questions. Essentially, do the learners at these institutions think of themselves primarily as students? And as you can imagine, right, overwhelmingly, the answer is no. These are people with full lives that happen to also be going to college.
Right.
And I don't think any of the systems that our institutions have, particularly community colleges where that's more likely to be true, which is where most of our students are, right? I don't think any of the systems are set up in that way for the most part. I mean, we know all of our community colleges are doing great work to serve their populations, and they're very aware of who their populations are. And so I don't want to discount or discredit, institutions that are doing great things to support their student parents and their students that have transportation challenges and challenges with housing and food security and all of these things. Like, we know there's good work happening, but I think the baseline is not that, right?
Yeah.
Whenever we talk about these programs that, an institution has this fantastic food bank, but it's not set up as a food bank, right? It's like this great way that destigmatizes it and allows, or like we have these wraparound services. It's like a student center where you can come and, get your paperwork done and get a meal and. We raise up all of these incredible examples, right? Because they're not the baseline. Like, I think fundamentally our systems and institutions are not set up to welcome students as whole people. And again, I hesitate to put the burden or the blame for that on our schools, because ideally we would have like a really robust, not to go fully political on any of this, but like we would have a really robust social safety net and infrastructure to provide for all those other things, right? Like, ideally, anyone who's enrolled in college would already know where their next meal is coming from and would not have to worry about housing security. But that's not the reality. And so, oftentimes our schools are increasingly asked to do more. And that's not the baseline. That's not what they're set up for. And that's for a reason, because that's not what they were designed to be. But increasingly, that's kind of the direction of things. And I think institutions are really doing a great job doing what they can to provide so many needs beyond academic.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, Rachel, you've written and spoken about enrollment declines hitting rural colleges pretty hard. How should state leaders interpret enrollment data without jumping to the wrong conclusions about these numbers when they're seeing them?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, I think my assumption from your question would be, the wrong conclusion might be closed schools, right? And so I think, as with all things, I would say, in a rural context and talking about rural policy and rural education in particular, I think the thing that gets lost so frequently, particularly when we're talking about policymakers, is speaking to folks in communities, right? I've been doing this work for a long time, and I continue just to be floored at having conversations with policymakers or funders or other partners in the space that talk about a new initiative or a policy or a decision that's being made. And when things, perhaps don't turn out as intended, my first question is always, well, who did you work with? Who did you talk to in the community? Were you talking to the college presidents? Were you speaking to faculty? Were you talking to student associations, right? Getting student feedback and voice in the decision making? And the answer is almost always no. I mean, I don't know how we're still here. And so I think, rather than me to give any particular advice, right? And particular in every rural community, and the context will be different. And, therefore the solutions to enrollment decline are going to be different. I would really encourage policymakers to talk to your people, right? And again, we know, there's a lot of really interesting research about representation in state bodies, in state Congress, and, representation from rural communities tends to be low, right? For a whole number of things that, track and tie into other things we know about rural communities. But I think, being on the policymaker side, really intentional about outreach and going into your communities that you represent, even if they're not the ones that you're from, to get a better understanding of what the community is looking for and what they think, right? Because rural places and rural colleges frequently know what's best and know what's next, and they just need the support from, their legislators. And on the other end, I would say to, rural community members and college staff and leadership, the reverse also has to be true, right? Like, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, closed mouth doesn't get fed, all of these aphorisms. You have to be really vocal about what your needs are and about, that you do know what's best for your community. I heard an anecdote that I really love from someone who actually worked in rural health policy, but she was telling me about, her kind of tactics and strategy and trying to get her voice heard when she's meeting with legislators that, primarily work, are from and service districts that are primarily urban. And telling me about, in a particular community they were working in, the hospital was at risk of closing. And they were having a lot of difficulty messaging and trying to get support from the state legislature. And she went to, this one representative who was from an urban district and had been, famously just not really supporting. They weren't getting a lot of traction with him. And she said, look, she came with all the statistics and, brought her data to back her up and said, our hospital's at risk of closing. Here's what that's going to mean for your beloved urban hospital. My people are uninsured. Here's how many of them are on Medicare, Medicaid. And here's how far it is for them to get to your urban hospital. It's not that far, right? Like, this is the closest hospital to them once ours shuts down. Here's the data on what we think is going to happen to your urban hospital when ours shuts, right? And so I just thought that was such a, elegant and clever way to really get at like the interconnectedness of all of our communities, right? Sometimes you're going to encounter people who don't care about, our policymakers, our legislators. They should care about our communities because they should care about our communities, period. But if that doesn't work, right, you have to find the right angle. And there were other communities that this legislator cared about. And that was, what helped kind of tip the balance there, that, he understood the implications of additional pressure on a hospital he did care about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was very smart. I'll just say that was very smart.
Yeah. So I think, messaging matters and figuring out, where those conversation points and how that kind of data and storytelling can come together to get what we need for our communities.
Yeah. I want to shift to focus just a little bit, Rachel, and talk about dual credit, because that really, when it's done right, is early college access for a lot of our students in rural schools. And it's often presented as the solution. Can you talk about what it looks like when it's really equitable, when it's truly equitable and high quality for students in rural places?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are plenty of, I'm sure, instances where this is done really well and done right. I think, equity for rural students in dual credit has to take into consideration, a lot of the things that we've already talked about on this call, right? Transportation. I think the biggest factor that we see in designing equitable dual credit programs for rural students really are around logistics, right? There's certainly considerations. Rural places are not monolithic and certainly not monolithic demographically, right? So we know that there are a lot of students of color in rural communities. We know there are first generation and low income students in rural communities, and all of these other kind of characteristics that we know can make college going more intimidating or, more challenging for different reasons. But I think really the thing about what makes programs more equitable in a rural context really is, from what I've seen, more focused around those kind of logistical components. If there's no public transit, and, the school district or the college are not thinking about that in programming, then you're not going to get the students that need this the most. If you're not thinking about, the types of programs that students might be looking for. And then again, I think really that going back to just that kind of information, right? Who are you communicating about this program with, and how are you communicating it? One really cool approach that we saw in some of our community college work in Kentucky was at Hazard Community and Technical College. And so I don't know if they still do this, but a number of years ago, they would have movie nights on campus. And so again, kind of going back to that, rural college is the community hub, and not just for dual enrollment, but for all programs. The college president herself and a number of members of staff would be there on campus and, before the film, at intermission, after the film, going around to folks just sitting down on blankets and chairs and saying, hey, how are you? Have you ever been to campus before? Well, what does it feel like to be on campus, right? And just engaging in these very low stakes conversations to try to draw people in and let them know, right? You're already on campus just to watch a movie. But that alone kind of takes away some of the, perhaps the fear or stigmatization or this thought of like, this isn't a place I can come, right? Even when it is, in a small community and maybe a community that's kind of built around the college and it's a community college, many folks still have this kind of like, ivory tower fear, right? but you're there for a community event, and the college president is sitting right next to you going, oh, that's so interesting. You've gotten a couple credits in the past. You don't have a degree. Well, what do you think about coming back? Oh, your daughter's in high school. Did you know that we have this dual credit program? So I think, transportation, other logistical considerations, and then, figuring out what the communication looks like and who you're really providing access to.
Yeah. Yeah. There's also work-based learning. And I'm sure that you've probably seen some promising models that really connect rural students to work-based learning without, having a whole huge metro employer ecosystem, because obviously that's not going to happen in a rural place. Is there a kind of partnership structure that you've seen really has hit the mark that holds up over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been a little bit farther away from some of the work-based learning recently, and so I don't want to, talk about anything terribly outdated or, miss any great examples. But to pivot just a little bit, perhaps one thing that we've been really excited about recently is some of the partnerships and work we've been doing around play-based learning. If I can speak about that for a minute. So I think it is related, right? Because it all comes down to kind of skills and, making sure that we are teaching students in ways that are really engaged and hands-on, right? So it's not just about rote memorization or, hours in the classroom, but how are we getting students up and moving and physically and literally engaging with the materials and with the things that they're learning about. And so we have a partnership right now with Beth Benedicts from the Castle, who I know has been a guest in the past, and North Putnam Community Schools. I'm sorry, I don't know what their community schools are. What was it? We have a partnership right now with Beth Benedicts from the Castle, who I know has been a guest before, and the North Putnam School District to bring play-based and creative programming into the school to support literacy. So we're working with second grade teachers, families, and communities to bring in what's called an embodied literacy program. So they're going to be bringing in some artists and musicians and community members to do some active workshops with students, promoting literacy through art and music. They're also already beginning to host family and community literacy nights, so talking about what literacy means with parents and promoting literacy skills. And then there's, of course, a component of professional development for teachers and teacher leaders as well, so that they feel, comfortable and ready with this content. So we're really excited about that. I think, a lot of times in work-based learning approaches, and I think in education more broadly, I worry a lot about this kind of philosophical idea of value capture, right? Where we get so caught up in trying to measure the things that we're trying to improve, that we end up changing the things that we do so that they match what we measure, right? And so, an example of that in the literacy context, right, being like looking at test scores, right? So we become really focused on test scores as this concrete way we can measure literacy. And so then, of course, we move towards how are we ensuring that students are successful on the tests, right? Rather than ensuring, how do we make sure that kids are curious, engaged, lifelong readers, right? Like, how do you inspire a love of reading? Because that's not going to show up very easily on the tests. And right, of course, it makes sense. You want to be able to track how students and teachers are doing. You need quantifiable metrics to get funding and all of these other things. But at the same time, how do we ensure that we can both do that, measure the thing, and set kids up for true success, to be lifelong learners, love reading, right? Because I think that, while it's perhaps less easy to quantify and measure, we know will pay dividends, right? Lifelong.
I want to jump into that data point that you just brought up, because you've been a really strong voice about data capacity and how education data is used. And so can you talk a little bit about what we're measuring well and what we might be missing that rural communities really need to see? Is there a particular blind spot that maybe leads to bad policy or bad decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of feelings about this, as you know. So I think a lot of our work at Research Ed is focused around data capacity, particularly in post-secondary education. And a lot of the work that we do is particularly supporting community colleges or otherwise small, under-resourced or rural institutions with their data capacity. A lot of that work is with institutional research offices. So offices on college campuses that are doing research about their own students, right? And frequently what we see is these offices are doing really great work, but they are frequently teams of one. They are tasked with federal compliance, state compliance, scholarship reporting. And then when all of that is said and done, right, they're getting requests from leadership. Hey, how many students do we have in our dual enrollment program this year? How's that compared to last year? Right. And when all of that is done, right, then they go, we have all this really cool, interesting information we're saying out about our students. Maybe we could take a look at the student surveys that Academic Affairs put out last year. There's no time for that, right? And so a couple of different things. I think one is, it's really difficult to collect, measure, analyze, think deeply about data on student experience and the role that that plays in student success because these offices are so overburdened and underfunded. And so I think, more proactively and effectively engaging with student voice as a data point is something that we're really missing. And the other thing that I think, to your question, kind of more about like data that drives bad policy, perhaps, we're seeing some really cool work just starting to emerge, I think, in the community college space around this. One of the, I think most standard and kind of traditional metrics around institutional success is graduation, right? How many students are you graduating? And that's fair, right? As students, as parents, as consumers of education, right? We want to know what is the likelihood that I will be successful at that institution, right? Kind of going back also to my initial freshman year panic. I'm like, oh my God, I know there's this really high percentage of students that don't finish college every year, right? What does that mean for me? And so that's what people are looking for and what, policymakers and state funding mechanisms look at when they're trying to figure out how to disperse funds to colleges. And so community colleges have for a long time been plagued by this idea that they're low quality, right? For a number of reasons. I think central to all of that is that they have low graduation rates frequently. And I think that that's, again, kind of goes back to this idea of sort of value capture, right? We're not necessarily measuring the right thing. Community colleges, as we've kind of already discussed today, are more likely to serve, students that are first generation, students from low income backgrounds, right? Because of the kind of accessibility of the institution, students that might have different levels of academic preparedness to begin with. And so, of course, the graduation rates are going to look different. At the same time, community colleges have a different mission than other institutions. Not every student that enrolls in community college intends to graduate with a 1 or 2 or 4 year degree. Many of them are looking to transfer. Many of them are looking to upskill. And so I think, graduation rates can be, looking solely at a college's graduation rate can be a real detriment to, their reputation, to their funding, to have a lot of other implications. I've been really encouraged by the work of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. They have a new kind of pilot community college survey and study that they're doing where they incorporate a number of different factors to recalculate a community college's success rate that goes beyond just graduation, to recalculate how effectively community colleges are serving their students. And I would encourage, listeners and if there are policymakers out there to check this out and really try to think about, what the students, who the students are that community colleges are serving and what the goal is of, what the goals are of community colleges as institutions in considering, what a good metric looks like.
You interact with rural college students and their experience, and you're hearing from students often. Can you talk a little bit about what you're hearing from them that leaders and policymakers really need to understand?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that there aren't very many people who are hearing from students. And of those that do, what they're hearing from students is not necessarily something that's being incorporated into action. So again, kind of going back to the data question, right? We know from a lot of the colleges we work with, first of all, many of them don't do anything about, trying to engage with student voice or collect information on student experience. Of those that do, and there are many, and I laud them for their efforts, we've spoken to so many institutions that collect this information and then no one looks at it. And so that's really disheartening to know, they've taken that first step to try to be more proactive, get feedback from students, but it's not translated into action. And so I think, one thing that we hear from students is that they feel that, right? They don't necessarily feel like they're listened to by their institutions. We did a focus group a number of years ago with some students and a couple of community colleges that were looking to try to make better alignment for kind of work-based learning opportunities for students that were perhaps already working somewhere that was somewhat career aligned, but not necessarily kind of making that through line. So I'll give an example. There were students that were looking to get nursing credentials that were working in hospitals, but were working, for example, on cleaning staff, right? And so the institution was trying to figure out, especially in these rural communities, college and the hospital have great partnerships, right? How can we kind of facilitate these relationships to be able to maybe help that student make a transition, right? Rather than working part-time on the cleaning staff, you're working to get your CNA. Is there some way we can get you more involved in, trying out some of those skills that you're developing on campus? Yeah. And what was really interesting that we heard in speaking to students was that this wasn't something they were interested in, which was, I think, a surprising finding for a lot of folks. And what it really came down to was trust. What we heard most from students was, in asking, would you be interested in something like this? The college would really like to be involved in trying to help you, if you're working full or part-time while you're doing your studies, how can we kind of build some more alignment there? Why would they do that? Why would the college want to do that? What's in it for them? Am I just going to end up in some I don't want to work on campus. Is the college just trying to get free labor out of me? There were a lot of different, types of responses, but I would say like the theme throughout was really a lack of trust and a feeling from students that I'm just here to get my degree. I just come in for class and I leave. There wasn't this sense of the college as this like warm, supporting environment that was like there to help them succeed in whatever they do. And I think that's a huge disconnect. I don't think that you talk to many people when you go to, particularly, I think my love for rural community colleges shines through, but like, I've never been to a rural community college where I met a single person who didn't just exude that energy, right? Like they want students to feel like this is home for them. They can get anything they need here. And it seems like there's often a disconnect where, students on the other end just think of this as like a box they're checking off, right? I go to class, I go home, I go to work, come home, and they don't see why the college would be invested in bringing these pieces together.
No. Yeah. Well, Rachel, the question that I always end with is something that you've probably heard. What does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Yeah, I think, the through line in all of this and something we talked about at the beginning, rural advantage is all about relationships, I think. It's about the people. And, one of the perhaps defining characteristics of a rural place is that there are fewer of us than in other places, but those bonds are strong and it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that answer. And thank you for bringing a really clear lens to rural post-secondary success, one that really treats rural community colleges as infrastructure and treats student persistence as something that we need to design into the system. So I appreciate the way that you connect data to lived experience and really keep the focus on what helps students, not just to start, but to actually finish. So thanks for sharing your insights today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Well, friends, if this conversation sharpened your thinking, take one step next and ask your graduates what they're walking into, not just what they're walking out of when they leave your doors this May. Strengthen the handoff between your high school and local college and make it normal to talk about transportation and advising and belonging as much as transcripts. If the Rural Scoop is helping you lead with dignity, courage, and clarity, please like this episode, subscribe to the show if you're not already a subscriber. It really does make a difference. And leave a comment with your takeaway. Share it with a colleague who cares about rural students' success beyond graduation just like you do. I'm your host, Melissa Sadorf, and remember, in rural leadership, our strength is our shared story. When we lead together, we thrive together. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.